everyone, this is Sam Black, and welcome to Drafting Archetypes. Today I'm going to talk about drafting red-white in Crimson Vow Limited. Before I get started, I want to remind everyone that the notes are available on patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. That can let you follow along with what I'll be talking about on the episode today. That's available on patreon.com/draftingarchetypes for patrons, limited guru or above level patrons specifically. Okay, so red-white wins 55.9% of the time, which for those who aren't looking at the distribution probably don't know where that puts it in the grand scheme of things. It wins less than black-red, blue-white, red-blue, and red-green. So kind of middle of the pack, least successful with the red archetypes, but red archetypes in general do pretty well. Not like a bad archetype that you need to avoid, but not an archetype that I'm personally looking to end up in myself. I think that red is a touch overdrafted, if anything, and if for some reason red is open and I should be drafting red, white's not the color I would look to pair with it personally. So this is an archetype that I personally end up in fairly infrequently. That said, if you're in a space similar to where I am, where you're primarily avoiding green in this format, this is an archetype that's compatible with that. So I would expect to end up here rarely, but occasionally. The primary issue with red-white in this format is typically red-white is an aggressive archetype. And I believe that if you look at the paper insert that comes in boosters that tells you kind of like the description of what all the color pairs are about, if I remember correctly, red-white is actually listed as its theme is just like being aggressive, which is surprising in its lack of precise thematic cohesion. But I think that that's what's going on here, which really more than anything else speaks to the designers didn't even really try to give you a specific thing to work toward. And I would also argue that to the extent that aggression is what red-white is about, that doesn't even particularly come through in this limited format compared to other limited formats. The issue is that the strongest cards in red and white are removal, card filtering, and life gain, which are not naturally particularly aggressive. You're basically, like, your best cards are, at common, are Flame Blast Bolt, Abrade, Sigarda's Imprisonment, Traveling Minister, Sigarda's Imprisonment, Falcon Wrath Celebrants, and Kindly Ancestor. And then, like, the next best creatures are Voldaren, Epicure, and Heron of Hope. It's all about, like, making sure that you don't flood, but, like, there's this, like, life gain thing going on. Like, the creatures are fine, they just happen to gain life, which means that some portion of their strength is not devoted to ending the game. So red-white ends up in this kind of confusing space where it's very similar to black-white or even red-black. Typically, I wouldn't want to play like Mardu because often those archetypes tend to be aggressive, and when there's not very much fixing, it's hard to cast your spells. But I have played Mardu successfully in this format because what all three of those pairs are doing are so similar and have so much overlap that if you focus on using blood and removal spells and playing a long game and playing an attrition game and trying to just like wear your opponent out, the cards work well together. And I feel like if your goal is, as one's goal usually is in an aggressive deck, to end the game before your opponent can use all their resources, I don't think that the cards lend themselves especially well to doing that. You're just not great at pushing large amounts of damage early in the game, especially when like Fierce Retribution is one of the better white cards, and like it's not an efficient way to remove a blocker, but it's an efficient way to remove an attacker. And so red-white's not very aggressive. This isn't like red-white in Kaldheim or other sets where you're maybe like going tall with like suiting up an evasive threat and killing your opponent before they find a way to deal with it. This is like more reliant than red-white usually is on evasion and reach. Like this deck actually makes pretty good use of Kessig Flamebreather. Structurally, I think that it's a lot more mid-range than it might be presented as. It does have closing power. A lot of the good uncommons are aggressive, but the top uncommon is Voltaic Visionary, which is a good aggressive card, but its strength is primarily in the fact that it gives you an extra card, which speaks to the fact that this is kind of more about attrition than it is about aggression. Alluring Suitor, Markov Waltzer, very aggressive, very just good aggressive creatures, but they're more just overall powerful cards than like purely aggressive. Markov Waltzer is very much about attacking. It has evasion. It has an ability that only works on your turn, so it's only working like while you're the one initiating combat. But I feel like the game is more about establishing persistent damage than big damage outputs. So, and we see that in, for example, Nurturing Presence having a higher win rate in red-white than any of the 2-mana creatures. Blood Petal Celebrant, Drugskull Infantry, and Kessig Flamebreather being the best of them. Nurturing Presence, which puts less power onto the table, but gives you an evasive threat, performs better. And so it's more about having this removal to stop your opponent from blocking your flyers and stop your opponent from killing you, while you use Traveling Minister with flyers like Nurturing Presence, Heron of Hope, and Markov Waltzer to push damage. Kessig Flamebreather is pushing damage. You can use Wedding Invitation and stuff. There are games where you'll, maybe like curve out with ground creatures and maybe, use a Sigarda's Imprisonment on your opponent's blocker and just kind of like run your opponent down. But I think that that's a smaller portion of games than it would be in successful run with Red-White in Midnight Hunt. Red-White in Midnight Hunt was weaker overall, but it was more, I would say, focused traditionally on just like, well, I have aggressive cards, I'm hoping to beat you with them. Whereas here, because of the existence of blood and a lot of good removal, you're much more likely to end up in a spot where you're just answering all your opponent's stuff and playing kind of a normal late game. And because red-white plays so similarly to red-black and black-white, I think there are a lot of games that are just kind of like in this scrappy blood and small creatures and removal is what like both players have. And so you're just kind of like trading resources and playing small games and just hoping to come out on top with the last thing standing or whatever. At the end of the day, what that means for me is that red-white isn't exceptional at doing anything. It's not bad at doing it. It's just doing the same thing that other colors are doing. And I guess I would often prefer to have black as one of the colors, largely, interestingly enough, just for pointed discussion, or blue for card draw. But when so much of the format is in this kind of like more interactive, everyone's prioritizing and playing removal to deal with bombs, and no one's really that great at ending the game kind of space, I would really like to have a deck that has a little bit more raw card advantage than what red-white is capable of, which again is why we see Voltaic Visionary being so successful. Interestingly, I would expect the Impulse the Light Up the Stage type card to maybe show up as a way to deal with that, but I don't remember it having great stats. But I want to step back a second and touch on the thing that I was saying about Nurturing Presence being the most successful 2-drop. There's a little asterisk by that note for me, which is Nurturing Presence has a higher win rate than the 2-mana creatures. However, Nurturing Presence, interestingly, has a worse improvement when drawn than cards with a comparable win rate. And this is the way that I like to use the improvement when drawn stat. I don't trust it by itself, but I think that it can give context to other cards. And in the case of Nurturing Presence, what I believe is going on here is because it's so important, if you're going to put Nurturing Presence in your deck, to be able to play it early, ideally on curve, which requires having a 1-mana creature, you are more likely to play Nurturing Presence the more 1-cost creatures you have in your deck. And I also believe that the more Traveling Ministers and Voldaren Epicures you have in your red-white deck, the stronger that deck is. So I think that Nurturing Presence is more likely to be played in good decks or with cards that are independent, that are strong separately from that. So a lot of Nurturing Presence's high win rate, I think, is just it's being carried by the cards that it's played with. And when you don't have Traveling Minister, you both win less and don't play Nurturing Presence. So that would lead me to not necessarily prioritize Nurturing Presence over Drogskol Infantry when I'm drafting red white, especially if I don't already have Epicure's and Ministers to know that the presence will be good. So this is a spot where you don't want to just trust the higher win rate as indicating that it's a better card or will make your deck better. The only commons in red and white that win more than red white's average are the premium removal spells Flambush Bolt, Abrade, and Sigarda's Imprisonment, and Traveling Minister. I'm still not totally sure how to parse that information. There was another deck where almost none of the commons won more than the deck's aggregate win rate, and some decks where that was far from true. My guess is that when that happens, it's more important to have uncommons, whereas when there are a lot of commons that win more than the aggregate win rate, if you put the right commons together, you'll do well. But I believe that a lot of the strength of red-white is in the uncommons. Your commons are like removal and support cards, and you really want to have your Voltaic Visionaries, Alluring Suitors, Markov Waltzers, Angelic Quartermasters, Twinblade Geists, all of that stuff as the to give you a core of strong aggressive creatures. That means that basically it just means I only want to be red white if it's open, because it's not like these are cards where I will get them if other people aren't exactly red white. People are going to take the good red commons if they're any red deck. They're going to take the good white commons if they're any white deck. Markov Waltzer is the only card that will come to me if nobody's playing red and white together. So this is not, I talked about how blue-green wants specific cards to the blue-green archetype. And so it's very concerned with, is anybody else at the table blue-green? And it might not care if it's being passed to by a blue player and a green player who are doing something else. Whereas red-white, I don't really care if the person opposite me is in red-white, that's fine, as long as the people next to me are not in red or white, so that I can get 2 or 3 looks at the good red and white uncommons. That's what I want. So it's more about just independent good card quality in my colors, particularly premium uncommons and the premium commons. And then, every extra common creature I have to play that's not Epicure, Minister, or to some extent Falconwrath Celebrant, but there are diminishing returns there. Heron of Hope, but only if I have Traveling Ministers. I really want as many of my creatures as possible to just be uncommons. For that to be the case, I need to be at a table where, a table and seat that happens to see those cards, and for my neighbors to not be in those colors. So I think that means that it's this is an archetype where I would want to be here because I'm reading signals and believe these colors are open, rather than something that I would want to force or try to position myself into, because I just I don't think the commons are where you want to be. They're not going to be carrying you by themselves. That's my guess. Again, that's because I think that they're just not quite in sufficient alignment about how they want to play and what they're trying to do. I had just failed to previously do my dives into cards that look like they might be overplayed or underplayed in the archetype. No really big standouts there, except that the 2-drops, Drogskol Infantry and Blood Petal Celebrant in particular, are played pretty highly and not very successful. This is just points back to 2-drops in this format are pretty easily outclassed and can be hard to take advantage of. And it might be best to draft in a way that doesn't prioritize trying to make that work and might just accept that this isn't a format for them and to focus on doing other things with your deck. Relatively short lecture, but that's fine when that's what's going on. Let's turn it over to Twitch for questions and just go from there. Anyone in Twitch chat, if you have any questions or comments on red white, drop them in chat and I will answer them. While I'm waiting for that, I do want to thank the newest patrons at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Will and Sean, thank you very much for the support. All right, first question. Wedding Invitation performs well in both of the other murder color pairs, but curiously not well in red-white, with the vampire and life gain density in red-white. This is a little surprising to me. Any thoughts on why that might be? I also thought that was a little surprising. So the life gain is a little less important when you're not spending life because of the fact that you don't have access to pointed discussion. You're also not enabling the synergies on Courier Bat, which is another like high impact payoff for gaining life. There are a few other black cards that trigger off gaining life. And so I think like a lot of the reason that Wedding Invitation is performing so well in black decks is both that black decks are spending life and, more importantly, have specific trigger points that care about gaining life. And so the easy, reliable way to make those triggers happen when you want them to is a substantial portion of the strength in black. Also, red has some other, red and white have more other ways to get reach, such that they're not necessarily relying on the unblockability as much, thanks to Kessig Flame Breather and like Ancestral Anger in red, and then the flyers in white. That's my best guess there on what's going on with Wedding Invitation, but that's more speaking from just like reasoning through what we observe with the stats rather than like my specific experience with Wedding Invitation. Thoughts on Ancestral Anger and combat tricks as a method of getting through high toughness blockers, or would evasion be a better way to go? So Sure Strike is a card that has a reasonable performance in red-white, and the +2/+2 Indestructible performs not horribly. Ancestral Anger also performs all right. Ancestral Anger is going to be a lot better if you have Twin Blade Geist or Kessig Flame Breather or a lot of Ancestral Angers. I definitely think that if you do end up in the like more aggressive spot like version of red, where you're playing just like more of the cheap creatures and less removal, basically. So, presumably there are going to be some powerful cards in your deck. If instead of having Voltaic Visionaries and Markov Vultures, you have Abrades and Sigarda's Imprisonments, you are less likely to want combat tricks. If you have less of that premium removal and more of those like premium creatures, you're more likely to want ways to push damage in combat. Markov Waltzer in particular is a card that, plays pretty well with Sure Strike in particular. I think that there you really just want to, the more creature-based your deck is, the more you want combat tricks. And the more removal you have, the less you want combat tricks. Next question/comment. I've been conceptualizing red-white in VOW as bad blue-white. Similar overall game plan, but trading in blue interaction plus card advantage for reds. Are there any strengths of red-white that I'm missing with this idea? The main thing that red is offering you is more removal, which is what white's offering you. So there's redundancy there, but the redundancy means that you can plan for it, or if you're not seeing the removal in white, you can swap in the removal in red if removal is the thing that you need. I agree with you in that I prefer pairing removal with card advantage, and so I feel like if I have the removal in red, I'd rather pair it with the card draw in white. If I have the removal in white, I'd rather pair it with the card draw in blue. If I have the removal in white, I'd rather pair it with the card draw in blue, rather than like doubling down on removal. Like I like to just say, okay, I'm blue, and then I'm going to be either red or white, whichever color I'm seeing good cards in. But hypothetically, someday blue might not be open, then I wouldn't be able to do that. To your question, you're certainly asking someone with a considerable bias. I am very likely to agree, yeah, I want to be blue. I can't say that there's no advantage to just being red-white instead, doubling down on your removal and trying to end the game and saying, well, I don't really need card draw because I have like blood from Falconwrath Celebrants or whatever. But that's what you have. The next question or comment is about Honeymoon Hearse, which Beers says has been the go-to for getting through large creatures, and acknowledging that it has really bad stats. I think Hearse is pretty interesting. It's a card that I played against a little and had some trouble with, and then I've largely avoided because its stats are really, really bad. But I do think that its stats are likely driven down by people playing it in decks that can't support it. And if you have a very large number of 1 and 2 drops, I think it's actually pretty good. I have played it very, very little, but I have sideboarded it in to very good effect. And just like the text of the card reads like it should be good to me if you're reliably playing a creature on turns 1 and 2, which I do think red-white is likely the best color pair at doing, or certainly an above average color pair at doing it. So it's easy to believe, or easy for me to believe at least, that despite the stats, it is possible to have red-white decks that would use Hearse well. I would feel good about being in that space. If I had a deck that had a lot of Ministers and Epicures, I would be happy to play the like Hearse theme deck. But I do think that you want to be really, really careful about not over applying your use of Honeymoon Hearse. It's one where like if you're not totally there, you don't want to like stretch it because it's the fail state on I just don't have creatures to crew this, or I have to crew this with big creatures and it's not getting me anywhere. That's a really high cost. Similarly, if you have too much removal, you don't want Hearse because you don't need the Hearse to be able to get through with your creatures and you're less likely to be able to crew the Hearse. So this is kind of for the like, if you're red-white Hearse, you're operating in the fail state where you just like haven't gotten a lot of removal. And I was just talking about how I don't want to be red-white because I'm kind of like doubling up on removal and I'd rather play the removal that I've seen in one of those colors with card draw in blue or black. So it feels like if you're both those colors, you likely have a lot of removal and then you wouldn't want Hearse. And then if you imagine that that's often happening, but that people are playing Hearse anyway, that explains why the stats would be bad. And if you understand all that, you only play Hearse in your very low curve, high creature count decks, I could see Hearse being good. Another great creature to play with Hearse, of course, being Casting Flamebreather, which you're happy to have in play, happy to have crewing your Hearse, getting value off of. So that one plus the 1-drops in particular is going to be the best way to go about Hearsing people. Comment, not so much a question. I feel like you end up red-white by starting in strong red uncommons and white being significantly more available than blue or black. I agree that that's a very common path. More of the top cards are red than white, though. I mean, you could hypothetically start with like a Valorous Stance or Angelic Quartermaster, but you're more likely to start with a Voltaic Visionary, Alluring Suitor, Flame Blast Bolt, Rending Flame, or Abrade. I do think, it's just there are more first pick red commons and uncommons than there are first pick white commons and uncommons. And the strong red uncommons really don't care what color you pair them with. So it's kind of just like, all right, well, I take these good red cards. Everyone around me also took good red cards. So I can't just like stay open through all of pack 1. So I end up needing to go to whatever color I'm seeing, which means that I'm basically going to go to a color that has strong commons. And I do think that white has reasonably strong commons that go kind of late and play reasonably with the red cards. So I do think that like that's often going to be the story in terms of how you end up there. Next comment or question. Red-white is bad at splashing, but it has some similarities to green-black in terms of being a good stuff deck that relies on being open. Yes, good point. How much should I be looking to splash here? And as a result, should I be interested in taking Forsaken Statue highly in this archetype? No. Green-black, you're looking for raw card quality and can splash well. Red-white, you should only splash if you find a single pip bomb that you really, really, really want. Red-white's curve lends itself really, really, really badly to needing to play Heirloom because I guess it's not that bad. I could imagine a red-white deck where you're all 1-drops, 2-drops, Heirlooms, and Falconwrath Celebrants. That deck actually doesn't sound that bad to me. Like, if you end up red-white and you need to splash, you should try to be 1-drops, 2-drops, Heirlooms, and Falconwrath Celebrants, and your splash cards. But I would say that's a very unusual place for you to happen to be when you decide that you're going to splash in your red-white deck. And in general, red-white still wants to be like, proactive aggressive, even if it's not like the fastest beatdown deck that's like tempoing your opponent out or ending the game before they get to like use their cards. But you're still, trying to be a front foot deck, trying to be pushing the game toward its conclusion, ending the game before your opponent hits 7 mana rather than after, even if you're not ending the game before your opponent's had a chance to play most of the spells in their opening hand. Whereas green-black is much more, green-black's also a card quality deck, but it's much more about like blocking and casting expensive spells, and you have your like natural green fixing anyway, and a higher curve that can take advantage of playing additional mana sources and stuff. So I certainly wouldn't equate red white to green black there, even if you're correctly identifying, hey, both of these decks are kind of like low synergy, high card quality focus, just like I want to have good cards type decks. Green black is much better positioned to splash to get that card quality, which is why I talked about only wanting to be in red white if you're like reading signals and feel like it's pretty open. Question. This feels like it wants to be a white creature deck with red support. Does that seem most likely? Not if you count the uncommon creatures. Like, what I really want is Voltaic Visionaries and Luring Suitors, which are red. I think that as far as outside of that, like, Falconwrath Celebrant and Voltairan Epicure are both very good creatures. Blood Petal Celebrants are relatively good too. Custic Flame Breathers are relatively good too. The good white creatures are Traveling Minister, Kindly Ancestor, Heron of Hope, Drog-Skull Infantry. So really, you just you don't want to play the 3 and 4 mana red commons that much, but I mean, it's not that bad if you have to play like the 2/3 Menace Werewolf or whatever. But so I don't know. I wouldn't say it's like heavily skewed toward white creatures red support. I mean, like the white support's solid and the red creatures are solid. So yeah, I mean that can happen, but it doesn't come through as particularly prominent for me. Next question is a good one. I assume this is another deck that doesn't really want Ceremonial Knife because it's red. Is that right? Which is a great question because this is obviously red, which doesn't want knife, and white, which does want knife. However, I would say yes, you will likely have enough blood from your red cards that you don't want to spend a card on knife to get blood because blood has diminishing returns. And you want to prioritize Voltairan Epicure and Falconwrath Celebrants highly enough that you won't need the knife for additional blood. Also, you have less synergies with the knife than, say, like white-blue, where you get additional disturbed cards. Here's a question. Why are all the 1-drops so good and most of the 2-drops so bad? And the answer is that the 1-drops are designed as utility creatures, and the 2-drops are designed as brawlers. But the 2-drops as brawlers don't brawl well because most of the 2-drops are 2-power creatures without evasion, and most of the 3-drops are 3 toughness creatures. So when your opponents, and sometimes they're not just 3 toughness creatures, but they are specifically Kindly Ancestor. And so when your 2-drops are reliably getting bricked by your opponent's 3-drops, that's a bad start. There are formats where the 2-mana creatures are 2/2s or 3/2s, and the 3-mana creatures, well, let's ignore the 3/2s. There are formats where the 2-mana creatures are 2/2s and the 3-mana creatures are 3/2s, and then the 3s don't brick the 2s and the 2s trade up and 2s perform well. But the 3-mana creatures usually have 3 toughness or are something like Spore Crawler, where you're not really happy to trade a 2-drop with it anyway. And it's just more likely that your 2-drops don't get to attack, multiple times or attack at all if you're on the draw. They're less likely to really get you anywhere. If they also don't block well, which a lot of the 2-drops in this format don't, then you're not getting value. Then they come into play pacified. They don't profitably attack or block. Whereas the 1-drops both cost less mana, don't really take a meaningful turn to get into play, and also the fact that they can't attack doesn't matter because you're looking at Traveling Minister that's going to keep having an impact late into the game, and Voltairan Epicure, which while it doesn't cycle, it does provide a meaningful amount of value right when you cast it, gets some damage, gets you the blood, and then has other utility in terms of, crewing a hearse like we talked about, or allowing you to double block a menace creature, or just chump block something huge, or even better, sacrifice to a creature with the sacrifice mechanic. I'm blanking on its name for some reason. But basically, the reason that 2-drops in general don't perform super well in this format is just the sizing of the 3-mana creatures, I think, is the primary thing that's keeping the 2-mana creatures in check. Also, on Reckless Impulse, another question about that. I did look at it, and it does perform poorly in red-white. Not super sure what's going on there. I don't know if it's that, you have high removal count, and like reckless impulse into removal can come at an awkward time. I don't know if it like puts you into trying to play kind of like a different kind of game than you want to play. I don't understand reckless impulse or red white, and certainly not the intersection well enough to speak to it exactly beyond saying the stats indicate that it's not working out. Even late in the format, particularly in formats where I have strong color and archetype preferences, there are going to be some things I don't know. That's one of them. Next question. Would I say the number one thing that makes me feel like it's open is wheeling one drops? No, I don't necessarily expect to wheel ministers, and I also kind of want to figure out if it's where I want to be earlier in the draft than that. So it's more just like, I think that this is less. So there are some spots that I try to figure out, like, is this open? Like specifically pick 8 through 10. I think with red white, it's more likely that I'm going to figure out if it's open like picks 4 through 6, where it's just like, oh, hey, this is like an abrade going weirdly late, or oh, this is like, I get a fierce retribution and then like a Cigarist imprisonment or whatever, kindly minister, traveling minister, what have you. I think it's more about like, are the like top commons still in the pack, in the middle of the pack, and less like, did I wheel the tear down from that? I'm gonna wrap this up before it becomes any more of a nightmare for my editor. Thanks everyone for tuning in as we wrap up Vow. I know we're very deep into the format now, and a lot of us are moving on to focusing on various cubes and other events, but always something interesting to look at or learn from archetypes in any given set. So I do think it's interesting to round this out just to see how stuff lines up in this format compared to other formats and stuff like that, and how it can inform us and just like make us better drafters and better at appraising color combinations in future sets and all that. So appreciate the dedication of everyone who's stuck with this as we get later into the format, and there's less time to leverage immediately any new skills in this archetype. Certainly, as we get toward the end of the format, I think it's important for me to keep in mind that any big picture lessons and comparisons to other formats that I can look at and highlight are going to be more valuable than just like, hey, here's how to, draft Crimson Vow. So as we get into, these last few archetypes, it's definitely going to be something for me to keep in mind on the production and content creation side. So that said, the only archetype I haven't talked about yet is green-white, the archetype that I've been saying all along I believe is probably best avoided. So tune in next week when I struggle to figure out how to justify and discuss playing or even thinking about that archetype. And have a good week and enjoy whatever form of magic you are up to these days. Bye for now.